Wow, this is now so we have volume and coffee.
Oh, yeah. I really did. Chris from New York, Boston, so it's go to. Down running and so.
Sweet. Hello.
Obviously,
You on SAG today, Leon?
yeah, right. So,
All right.
How much you find?
Will, do you take away? Of course. It was yours. All right. Well, good day, greetings and salutations, good people of the world. I am delighted to see you here. We are cooking up a great and robust book study for the summer. And we're going to get started on that in just a moment. We're going to let everyone get fully settled and caffeinated. You can sir. And John and I began, I guess it might have been almost 2 years ago. John asked me to read this book called Robert E. Lee and Me. And I think I read it in less than a month, and it was a page turner at the time that it's gone. We are live. Recording. I am recording. It was a page turner and enjoyable. We had great conversations about it. And my approach to the book was a bit guarded, but it was a disarming book. The way in which he writes and his own humility in approaching such a heavy conversation as racism, but also such a heavy conversation as systemic or structural racism within this massive institution of our military, and especially the through West Point school, which John can speak more about. So about a year ago, last August, John and I sat out and said, we think this would be a good class to team teach and would fall in alignment with our goals as a church and what we set out for about 3.5 years ago, 3.5, almost 4 years ago. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later today, but glad that you're here. We have a few guests with us online, and you're going to get a chance to introduce yourselves in a moment. And I'll change the screen so that we can see all of y'all more beautiful. Anytime that you're not able to be with us in person, every week we not only stream it live it's available via Zoom. It streams live on our YouTube channel, but you can also watch it if you missed that Sunday, later that Sunday, or anytime during the week to catch up. Okay. We will have your email information. And so I'll make sure that each week we'll do our very best to email you the handout in advance. So whether if you're not going to be able to be present, you can have it at your home, but we'll also print copies available in class as well. Great. Let us open with prayer. One of the things we'll do is John and I, we will open in prayer, and then each time we will close in prayer in a unison prayer. And the prayers that I've curated for the summer for this class are from a resource called A Booklet of Uncommon Prayers. So I've adapted them a little bit, but if you want to look that up, the PDF is available online, the copyright information there on the handout. So let us open in prayer. Let us begin. O Holy Spirit, giver of life, whose breath fills our lungs at this very moment, you are above all powerful and true. Be alive in us today against the silence towards racism in this land, that we might be filled with your words, words that heal, liberate, and offer hope in our day. Let us speak and let our lives be in tandem with our words. May they be a way of witness in the world for you and the liberation of your Black people, oh God. Amen.
Amen.
I thought it might be good. Many of you have had opportunity to get to know me, and many of y'all have. Some of y'all know John, but I want him to speak a little bit more to his own credentials, aside from just being an elder in our church. He's a current serving elder for our adult Christian education work and ministry. But he can speak a little bit more about his credentials outside of his ministries here at Hope. One of the things that connects me with this material is it connected well with the doctorate that I had just completed and the research that I did in collaboration with it. This is on a very different population than what I focused on. There was a lot of overlap, especially when we start to look at what is structural racism. And I'm going to unpack a little bit more about that today. But let me have John give a little bit of introduction about himself and his connection, his own experience, but also his connection with this book as well.
Great. Thank you, Josh. So Josh is right. I gave this book to Josh, actually this very book, and I took it back because I didn't want to buy another one.
Made me buy one.
I had all my marginal notes in here. But I read this book about 4 years ago, and my dad gave it to me. He bought it in Williamsburg, Virginia, where he retired. And I believe that the author, Ty Sedgwill, came and gave a speech or like a lecture at William and Mary College. And my parents retired in Williamsburg, and they go to these continuing education things. And I think, and I'm sure they'll watch the recording of this later and give me a call and correct me. But in any case, my dad read this book and said, "You have got to read this book." And so he sent it to me. I read it, and it's one of probably the 3 to 5 most impactful books that I've read in my life, because it presented this idea of what is structural racism, okay, or structural discrimination, because it's not just, it highlighted examples that weren't just about discrimination, but racism, but just structural discrimination in terms that were so stark to me about how the author, because of our shared backgrounds and the places I had been and the things I had seen and the people I had served with during the military, my time in the military, that I turned around and gave it right to Josh. I said, "Dude, you got to read this book." And to his credit, he did. And we've been having sort of a running conversation about it the last 4 years.
Yeah.
And I think now is the time is right. We read it and started discussing it before COVID when we got shut down. I think that a couple of things have happened in society and my life that have better prepared me to be able to talk about this book and try and put it in the right frame for all of you. I know Josh mentioned his doctorate and finding the sacred in the other. And the time is right, I think. One of the reasons that this was so impactful to me was during my very first stint as an elder, we signed Hope up to be a Matthew 25 church. Okay, and so our denomination, PCUSA, right? We'll talk about it. But when we got to the point, I was the elder in outreach, and so I had to go into the computer and actually, select one of the 3 pillars. And for me, I looked at revitalizing the congregation because I said, well, reducing structural racism, what role does Hope have in that? We don't really have racism here, and so, but that was ignorance. And I didn't understand, I didn't have a frame for really understanding what was meant by structural racism.
Yeah.
More facts about my back. So I went to West Point, right, in 1985, 1989. Then I did 20 years and a handful of months on active duty in the military. Turned around and became a defense consultant. The day after I retired. Actually, I double dipped for a while before I officially retired. I've been doing that for the last 15 years. So I've been in the environment. And I'll tell you that one of the things that was so impactful to me about this book about Robert E. Lee was because, as you'll find out when you read through the book, Robert E. Lee is inescapable at West Point. Barracks, gates, roads, awards, rocks, everything there has some connection almost to pictures in the classrooms, mantles, or murals in the mess hall. You can't get away from it. And in fact, one of the reasons I chose to go to West Point, besides the fact that it was an engineering school, was a recruiting poster. I think one of the most effective recruiting posters ever developed. And it was very simply, it had a picture of West Point in the background, the cadet chapel in the barracks, and around in sort of a diamond or a circular shape were portraits of Eisenhower, MacArthur, Patton, and then you had Grant and Lee. There was a couple other ones, but you had Grant and Lee facing each other, okay, in their Civil War uniforms. And the poster said, at West Point, much of the history we teach was made by the people we taught. But it's even central to that was this idea of Grant, Lee, and the Civil War. And so reading this book, I felt the author's transformation as he really goes in and deconstructs his values base, essentially, examines it, and then builds it back up in a more modern way, I think.
Yeah, thank you. So, subject matter expert, I'm excited for that. Let us do some introductions of yourselves. This is going to be a dialogical class, so I promise you, few of you want to sit there and listen to us yap for an hour. So this is all through the summer will be more of a dialogue and conversational. We'll have prompts to help us engage that. So there's a few things we want to do. One, we want to get to know you, and then also set some ways in which we hold these conversations. So I'm going to start with the folks who are on the Zoom, and there may be some faces you recognize and some that you don't. And after the Zoom folks, we'll come through the people who are here in the class, and I'd like for you to say your name and a summer destination that you have been to or that you're going to. Keep it simple, your name and a summer destination that you went to, you had a great time, or one that you're going to this summer that you're looking forward to. All right. The guy in the red hat.
Yes.
Yeah, your name. And
I'm sorry. My name is Clark Pengra. I am the facilities director at Hope Presbyterian. Josh, I actually read this book. I saw it on Josh's desk one day. And I said, what's this book about? And he gave me a real brief overview of it. I said, I'd like to borrow that if I could. I'm very much a student of history. And I was quite, I have to agree with John. It was very impactful. It really let me review some of the prejudices that I had, even though I think myself to be, I think we all think of ourselves as, well, I'm not prejudiced. But there are
Love
things.
you, Clark, but I'm sorry, buddy.
Am I going too long?
Yes, you are.
You're supposed to go like this.
Yes, I don't know if you can see me, but you're gonna get a chance to share all that. And so I want you to bank it and bring it back. You will get a chance to share that.
I'll answer the question for you though, my man. The question was, where have you been on the summer vacation or where are you going back to? And I'll say you went to West Point last week for your niece's graduation. You're going back this coming week for her wedding. So it ties it in, it's relevant.
Well, you stole my thunder, John.
Yeah. You weren't getting there, man.
I know.
Let me call on the bearded guy, Eric G. Eric G is a new face to all of you, but absolutely not a new face to me.
My name is Eric Hughes. I am currently in the car dropping my kid off at Van campus at Angela State University. But I've known John for years and years. Yeah. My wife is driving. I'm trying to.
Eric, let me fill in a little bit. We're having a little connection problems. We can see you. We hope you can hear us. We're having a little connection issue, so let me fill in the gap. I was one of those weirdos in college who was a part of two different fraternities. The first fraternity I joined was a little bit more Animal House, and Eric was my big brother in that fraternity. And those were wild years. And then I met Wendy, and then I joined the Christian fraternity. Eric and I, there's a lot of stories, but pretty much Eric and I closed down that fraternity. We wrote it out. It got on double secret probation, and there's stories that won't ever be told. Let's just put it that way. Not to mention my nickname that I had in that fraternity, which I won't share. He was the one who pinned. So I've known him for a long time. He has a 13-year-old who's just finishing confirmation, and he is in social services, the social psychology services north of Austin, and he's been following along here with our work and Hope Worship and Christian Ed for a while, and he saw this and said he wanted to be a part of it. So we're glad you're here, Eric. Kitty, we'll welcome you. Diana, you're next. Diane, you're next. Kitty,
Okay.
Your name and a summer destination. Keep it like 2 words.
Okay, I'm Diane Rogers, and I currently am at one of my summer destinations this summer. On the 22nd of May, I had a hysterectomy because I was diagnosed with endometrial uterine cancer on May 4th. And so very quickly, the surgical process happened, and praise God and thank you for all the prayers and good wishes from you all and many friends and Hope Church. And I am cancer free. It was stage 1. Everything was contained. I have no radiation or no chemo ahead of me. So I'm so blessed. And so I am now recovering in Encompass Health. That's in Round Rock on Hester's Crossing near La Frontera shopping area. And I've been here since last Monday. And so I'm getting 3 hours of PT and OT a day, and they are wearing me out
Thank you,
to
Diane.
hopefully help with my mobility and give me a chance for some good healing. Not sure yet how long I'll be here. That's yet to be determined.
Good, thank you. Kitty and then Carla.
Kitty Cosachata in Pagosa Springs, New Mexico.
Colorado.
Colorado, yes.
Good, thank you. Carla, your name and a summer destination.
Carla Young, Edmonton, Canada.
Woo-hoo. All right, we've made it to those who are in the room. Let's start at the back. We'll serpentine all our way back around to me, and I'll go last.
My name is Caitlin, and Roatan, Honduras. Yeah. We did, yes.
Holden Hedrick, Costa Maya, Mexico.
Okay, Sue Floyd, Nancy Gap, Virginia. Fancy Gap.
Yeah. Bill Floyd, Hudson, Ohio, which is northern
2 words.
Lake Erie and tow trails of the Erie Canal.
Marie Baker, Deep Creek Lake, Maryland.
Okay.
All right, Diana.
Diana Petrick and Maidstone, England.
Leon Schmidt, Hilton Head, South Carolina.
Julie Pratt, Lake Tahoe.
Natalie Day,
Indianapolis, Indiana.
Will Fisher. I'm going places. I haven't made up my mind on what I want to say, so you just go.
Little places, man. John Seaman, leaving later, well, in 2 hours to go to Guatemala, then Bahamas, then Jamaica, all for work.
Sure.
So,
And Josh Robinson, will be heading to Alaska in a week. I'm excited about it. Good. I wanted you to look on page 2 of the handout if you have it. And I think this, for some of you who've been in class with me before when we've had meatier topics, I've introduced these commitments of presence as a way of kind of setting the atmosphere for how we sustain a culture of relationship building and embrace each other, listen to each other, share with each other with regard to these heavy topics. So for those of us who are here, we'll read through these, and I'm gonna ask Caitlin if you'll start, and we'll serpentine through here. If you'll just read the first one and then Colton the next one, etc. And listen to these and see how they may strike you as we go through them.
Be fully present. Set aside the usual distractions of things undone from yesterday, things to do tomorrow, and things impinging on the present through technology.
Listen generously. Listen intently to what is said. Listen to the feelings beneath the words. Listen to each other as you would listen to scripture. Attentively, mindfully, and open to the holy.
We come as equals. No person's gifts, limits, or experiences are more or less important than another's.
It is never share or die. You will be invited to share stories, but you will determine the extent to which you want to participate.
No fixing. We are not here to change someone else's mind or fix them.
Suspend judgment by creating a space between judgments and reactions. We can listen to one another and to ourselves more fully.
Turn to wonder. If you find yourself becoming judgmental or cynical, try turning to wonder. I wonder what my reaction teaches me. I wonder what they are feeling right now.
Practice confidentiality care. What is said here stays here, but what is learned here goes out. Welcome discomfort and dislocation. Move against an instinct to construct a mental space of safety or to check out.
Love the questions themselves. Let your questions linger, release the compulsion to answer them, or to have them answered.
Before you turn the page, what I want to encourage you to do is to maybe read and review these a few times during the course of the week. We're going to read them each time that we gather. Some of these, I've been reading through these for about 6.5 years on at least a monthly, if not weekly basis, and letting these shape me and guide me when I'm engaging in those tough conversations. And so I want to encourage you to explore these and explore what they mean to you. And I promise you that every week, one may make more sense to you than another, though they're going to switch as you're going through them. The one for me today that may seem a little weird is the idea of practice confidentiality care, in part because we're recording this thing on the YouTube and anybody can watch it. That being said, that is no less a responsibility of ours to hold the stories that we share with each other with care and with love and with the gift that receive it as a gift, as we hope, you hope others would receive your story and your information as a gift. Make sense? Good. So let's talk a little bit, as John was talking about the PCUSA, Presbyterian Church in the United States of America. About 4.5 years ago, almost 5 years ago, they launched this initiative called Matthew 25. And inside of Matthew 25, you have 6 tenets, which is to feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, clothe the naked, welcome the visitor, to welcome the stranger, comfort the sick, and visit the imprisoned. And as a command from Jesus that by this is what we will be judged when the day of judgment comes. Now, building on top of those commands from Jesus, the PCUSA produced this program that has 3 pillars that all tie into that, because those 6 things can be identified in each of those 3 pillars. One is building congregational vitality. One is to eradicate systemic poverty. And the third one is to dismantle structural racism, as 3 pillars of what the PCUSA has been focusing on for the last 5 years through all of its programs, and especially through the identifying of those 6 tenets of Matthew 25. Our congregation signed up to be identified as a Matthew 25 congregation about, as John was saying, the fall of 2019, and we launched it January of 2020. In that time, we have asked ourselves, what does it mean for us to participate in programs that eradicate systemic poverty? What does it mean for us to participate and build programs that, or ministries that build congregational vitality? And over the last 4 years, this will be our 3rd class that we've offered that is focused in on what does it mean to dismantle structural racism. What I've included in the handout, one, as I emailed it out, and Marie, I don't think I had you, or I'm happy to email this back out to you guys, Will. There's hyperlinks there you can click and go to. If you go to pcusa.org/Matthew25, it's everything you're going to need. And it talks about those 3 pillars. But specifically on the structural racism page, the front page, I pulled this information from it, helping us to better understand what it is, what structural racism is. When we hear the word racism, we can be thinking about those overt acts of slavery, the overt acts of discrimination in the South, lynching, the dehumanizing of persons who are non-white, the non-dominant culture, etc. And those overt acts in society that we saw, such as segregated bathrooms, segregated buses. These were overt acts of discrimination, denying someone a job or benefits based on their color. These are overt acts of racism. And what PCUSA has done for us is to help us understand how the institution of racism has become not only embedded in our structures, but are still embedded in this generational aspect of racism, that once the civil rights movement was successfully concluded in the 60s, that, you know, there wasn't a magic wand and all of a sudden racism is gone and been purged from our society. You're talking about hundreds of years of systemic of racism that has been baked into our system, baked into our government, baked into our institutions, that have had generational effects after generation and generation after generation, that we as a society still have not recovered from. So the PCUSA identifies what is race, what is prejudice, And social power, they say, is the capacity of individuals and groups to determine what happens in society. Their decisions, actions, then shape society's values, beliefs, institutions, and systems. So from the colonies, from our early founding days with the colonies, the importing of the kidnapping, importing of slaves, through the Civil War, through Reconstruction, through Jim Crow, through the civil rights, all of this, our society has made the decisions in saying that it is okay, it is sanctioned. We have voted to say it is okay to discriminate, dehumanize, lessen one race over below another, and promote one race over another. In the last 70 years, our society has begun to take some of that social power and deploy some of these values, beliefs into our institutions and systems. And one way to look at that is the evolution of the society, evolution of the United States over the last 50 years, and what some of those freedoms, some of those more just practices are that are on the books today that did not exist on the books even 20 years ago, when we're thinking about persons in the LGBTQ community or persons of different colors and backgrounds and faiths in the 1970s. So social power is what we have as a community, because we all have the power to vote and to communicate with our elected officials, to choose our elected officials, and to vote in accordance to what our values and beliefs are, as we want to see them reflected in the society in which we live. More could be said on that. It would take a whole semester, but that is not what we're doing today. What is structural racism then? Structural racism is the normalizing of racism within institutions and structures. Because inequality is a part of the structures and the institutions that we interact with every day, it often goes unquestioned and unchallenged by most of society or the dominant culture. What do we think could be in this post-racism world that we live in? Because the magic wand was waved in the 1960s and we no longer live in a racist world. What do we think there are that could be examples of the ways in which we have normalized racism that are still within our institutions and systems, whether that is government, education, school, etc.? What could be examples of what that might look like?
Well, there have been so many examples of the police as an institution and the way that
The police.
and the way that they treat white people and people of color completely differently.
Right. It's just an unconscious profiling that could happen.
Well, it's not really unconscious.
Well, there could be, right? And there could be conscious, unconscious profiling. No, you're right. Conscious and unconscious profiling in our law enforcement agencies. Absolutely. Great. What could be other examples of what that might look like?
There's still discrimination in housing, even though it's illegal.
Okay.
Neighborhoods of how people, how they're settled in different neighborhoods and not settled in others.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about this in one of our sessions in July about housing, specifically as it relates to the city of Austin. You may remember, for those of you who were living here 8-9 years ago, Mayor Adler commissioned a task force, anti-racism task force. And one of the things that came out of that was that we have deeds on houses inside of the Austin Beltway that still say, these are live deeds that still say it can only be sold to persons who are not colored. And so there's been a legal process of trying to rewrite these deeds so that wording isn't there. But there's an example there of housing, the way in which we've structured our housing and the generational impact that it has had. How about one more?
Education.
Say more about education.
Well, so if universities have to use some sort of quota system to allow people of color in, obviously there's a failure in the lower public schools to make everybody ready to attend college.
Yeah,
And the schools that you'll see on the list of the ones that are targeted for closing because they're not meeting the grade, they're almost always minority schools.
Yeah.
There aren't any schools that are mostly attended by white students that are being closed because they're poor performing.
yeah, thank you. I have nothing more to add to that. I mean, again, I could take a semester, but I won't. Go ahead.
School finance
School finance.
is a big part of
Yeah.
of how, does the roof leak in your school? Do you have new textbooks or are your textbooks 30 years old and falling apart? Do you have, who is teaching in your school and what are their qualifications?
Yeah. Well, and even PTA funding, for example, 9 cents of a mile away from us is Anderson Mill Elementary School. This year, their PTA raised around $5,000 to $6,000. Across the street from us is Spice Road Elementary School. Anybody want to guess what their PTA raised this year? How much? How much? How much?
At 0.
50,000. 200,000?
136,000 in 8 months. That's 9 tenths of a mile apart from each other. But at the same time, we also know that here where our church is located is Anderson Mill Road that divides 2 neighborhoods. And that the building contractors of those, the housing people, I don't know these terminologies, who built these 2 neighborhoods used higher quality materials on one side and more affordable materials on the other. 40 years later, both neighborhoods established at the same time, we see things play out very differently when it comes to the types of schools, the students who go to the schools, the people who live in the neighborhoods, the funding of those schools, et cetera, et cetera. So school finance is a great example of that. And just having completed our state legislature session, we see the ramifications both with finance, housing, affirmative action, with a whole host of things that were debated but not addressed over the last several months. So these are great examples of that. A few things that I'd like for us to know, and again, if you got questions, we'll have time here at the end of the class. Racism is not measured by intent, but by its impact on those who are oppressed. I know that since I've been the pastor at this church, members of this church, when the topic of racism have come up, has said, racism doesn't exist anymore. And this is the magic wand theory, right? Once we had the civil rights movement, the magic wand has been waved, racism doesn't exist anymore. And I've had also minority members of our congregation who've also said, I don't know if I can stay at this church anymore because of the racism. And so I think there is examples there that it may not be overt, it may not be intentional, but there is still that undercurrent that can exist through our own lack of understanding and awareness, which I absolutely identifies as we go through and read the book, but also as we listen to folks. And we'll cover some of that.
Let me jump in there, Josh. So that is one of the core elements of this book as you read it, is that there's not necessarily an intent behind a lot of the elements of structural racism, and therefore they don't get addressed. They're just sort of, left to the side, okay, especially in the military. So an example of that, does anybody know what Executive Order 9981 was? Of course you don't.
Of course I do. Why don't you tell us, John?
But it was enacted by President Truman back in 1948. Okay, and it was the executive order which desegregated the U.S. military. 1948. Okay, so no more racism in the military, right? Okay, it's the proverbial magic wand that Josh talks about. But has anybody ever heard of Fort Cavazos?
Yes. Yes. They just changed it.
Yes.
Right,
It was.
Any-
It was worth it.
yes, right, okay, great.
2023,
Yes.
So what?
2023, there's the time report.
Yes, anybody know who it's named after? Cavazos.
He was a native, was he a native Texan?
Yes.
Person of Latin descent.
Yes, he was
Shit.
4-star general. He was that's great, thank you. But he was the first Hispanic officer at each of the general officer ranks. So he was the first 1-star Hispanic officer, the first 2-star, 3-star, 4-star. Okay, think about how long the U.S. military's been around. Okay, the U.S. Army. I served on active duty at the same time that this general did.
Wow.
I don't know him, he didn't know me. But you know, we're talking about lagging here. Also served on active duty at the same time that we had the first African-American 4-star general was on active duty.
Colin Powell.
No,
Excuse me.
Davis,
That's what I said.
Benjamin Davis. Now, again, not just about racism, but about structural discrimination. I'd retired 10 years before we had the first female 4-star officer. Okay. And we now have the first female combatant commander, warfighter, that I'm working with, and she is the commanding general of U.S. Southern Command. Okay, everything that we do below Mexico. And so even though we have legally taken some of these activities, they are still there in symbology and things like that. It's the same thing, you know, that you saw, you know, General Lee and me. My girlfriend Hillary, her younger daughter goes to a high school in San Antonio that is Lee Academy. It's on the campus of Lee Academy, right? And it used to be General Robert E. Lee High School. Okay, now it is capital L, capital B, capital B. Leadership and education excellence. But yeah, and so I mean, you got rid of it, but you know, again, everybody says, well, that's great. They took a very practical approach to renaming the high school, and they have to change their name and their letterhead and things like that. But that was done, as we'll learn about when we read in here. A lot of the things that were done in post-Civil War Reconstruction, like naming of military bases primarily in the South after mediocre political generals like Hood. You know, it was done to appease, okay, and promulgate at the end of the day this Southern myth of, you know, well, you know, we didn't lose and all of that kind of stuff, right? So rather than changing the name of the school to something else to honor, you know, a more appropriate person, for instance, they just changed the name. It's a great name, it's a great workaround, but how would you feel?
Yeah.
Right? Anybody ever heard of Camp Liberty or Fort Liberty? Anybody heard of Fort Bragg?
Oh, yeah.
Right? Fort Liberty is Fort Bragg. They renamed it. Now, again, I told Josh and I were like, well, you know, the reason it's Camp Liberty, Fort Liberty, is because U.S. Special Operations Command and the 82nd Airborne Division could not, both the tenant units on the base, couldn't agree on an appropriate person. The 82nd wanted to have somebody from the 82nd, Special Forces wanted a special. So compromise, right? But you see this all along in the book about, you know, how did we end up with all of these bases with these weird names?
Well, thank you. I know you got to roll. Take care. Good to see you again.
It was good to see all of you.
See you next week, bud.
See you next. Thanks.
And that the changing of these this last spring, we had already made our plans from last summer on the course. And then I don't remember how many bases were changed this last spring 12.
They're all getting,
Yeah.
I'll get the full list.
We said, wow, this is really timely in what we were already planning on doing. And this massive case that he makes in the book that we'll be reading.
One last thing,
please.
I wanna try, I'm gonna, for one of our later classes, I'm gonna try and get a fellow that I went to West Point with. He was a couple years ahead of me, but now is in the same company. I've worked with him, African-American guy, Carl Reed, who within my firm has taken a stance and has gone around like in the aftermath of the George Floyd debacle, right? I had a number of sensing sessions and again, I was just trying to get through West Point, okay, and stay in the Army. I wasn't worried about any of this other stuff. True white privilege, right? But to hear Carl talk about, being at West Point and having to live in Lee Barracks and walk down Lee Road and drive through Lee Gate. And then when he's out in the Army, being based at Fort Bragg, Fort Hood, all of these bases in the South, how that made him feel, and not being able to talk about it for 30 plus years because people are just, just what are you talking about? It's just a name, right? Is quite powerful to hear.
Yeah.
So hopefully we can do that.
I think that in the idea of walking those paths, both as one who is in a non-dominant group, like your colleague, and also those paths of walking those paths of being a part of the dominant group. I know that much like his own self-discovery, self-assessment of his privilege and his own sense of inherited, embedded, covert racism in his heart, I was able to identify with a lot of my own coming to understand and being aware of that. Kitty and I both went to the same high school in Amarillo, Texas, which was Tascosa High School. And their mascot is Robert E. Lee, General Lee. The year before I started high school there was the first year, that would have been like 89, 90, I think 90 or so. They had just banned the Confederate flag, that you couldn't bring the Confederate flag to school anymore. They couldn't wave the Confederate flag at the football games anymore, and they couldn't sing the Southern songs anymore, but they still had Johnny Rebel Rebel Lee. And the time that I was there was how offended I was that I couldn't bring my Confederate flag. And so we had all these secret ways of sticking it to the man by putting the Confederate stickers on our car. I had a Confederate flag on the back seat of my car, and at the same time there were all these students who were beginning to find their root and culture, African American students in Malcolm X, and wearing Malcolm X shirts and this, that, and the other. And I never had the ability to make the connection why they were so pissed off, and what that meant, and what the perpetual visual of Johnny Rebel and the gray Confederate uniform and the stars and bars, what that had on the psyche of their learning environment, much like attending the academy. And it wasn't until 2006, almost 15 years later, that I began to have some of that understanding of, oh, okay, now I get it. And I've spent the last 15 years again trying to unpack and understand some of those privileges that I walked through, unquestioned privileges that I'm able to walk through and navigate through, that are very complicated and difficult for persons either in a minority group or some other ostracized or stigmatized group. Whatever that may be. So I think what we wanted to pivot to for the remaining time that we have is doing some general thoughts, some general ideas of what you may hold, or maybe what you learned as a youngster about the Civil War, about who Robert E. Lee was, about West Point, and then we'll share, John will share a little bit about the author. I can confess that I knew zero about West Point until I met John. I don't even know that I knew what West Point was until I met John. And I really didn't even know anything more than that until I read the book. So that was a completely new material for me. But for y'all, what are some general thoughts that you have or things that you hear related to Robert E. Lee, the Civil War, West Point, the military, United States military, et cetera? Is that helpful?
Yeah, that's great. And what I did, I just wrote them, and y'all on the screen probably won't be able to see it because of the light, or the pen was a little light. But what I wanted to do is just sort of go around the room. I mean, not like an introduction or anything like that, but when you hear the term Civil War, what do you think? I'll go first, like war between the states. Right?
Yeah, or between the states, but kind of like what I've only read the introduction.
Oh, no, this is just from your own experience.
No, yeah, it was about slavery.
Okay.
It wasn't about necessarily secession. To me, I think that was always secondary. The other thing on the Robert E. Lee, I had someone many years ago try to say, I don't know if I can express this correctly. Not that he was for slavery, but that he was against. He was more of a Northern sympathizer than he was in the South. And when I was told that, I kind of like, that's not what I heard, not the way I remember it being taught.
Yeah.
Okay.
A lot of other folks.
So a few years ago, we went to a national cemetery in Chattanooga. And it has all the people that were buried from the Civil War.
Yep.
And just looking at all that, it's just like such a horrible waste for people fighting over something so stupid. That nobody should have ever had the right to own another person, and that should have been something that everybody knew. That you can't own a person.
I grew up in Maryland, which was a war state, and went to a lot of the Antietam, Gettysburg places, Harper's, places like that as Girl Scout tricks and that kind of thing. And all you talked about the battles, nobody ever talked about slavery.
Mason-Dixie line
Yes,
is in Maryland.
I literally grew up in a town on the Potomac River with West Virginia on the other side. So, yeah.
So you're saying more about that focuses, there's been a focus more on the militaristic aspect of the war, or the battles of the war, or the leaders, those involved in the war, than what the war actually was.
That's how I.
In a history setting.
Yes, when I grew up, it wasn't about slavery, it was about,
Right,
this was the dumb war, lots of people died. And we're gonna talk about the battles and who died and who won and all that, but not lives.
Yeah, a lot of times the Civil War now is taught chronologically and through the lens of a series of battles, right?
Yeah.
Rather than the causes behind it necessarily. Anybody ever hear the War of Northern Aggression? Right, I mean, that's it. How about the Southern Secession, War of Secession? Okay. How about we already heard economics, it was about economics. How about preservation of the Southern way of life?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Okay. How about it was fought over states' rights. Right? Okay. Anything to get around talking about slavery. Okay, even though if you peel that onion back just even one layer, you get to slavery. Okay, I'll give you that. It was fought over economics. What was the base of the economic reason? Trade. Well, okay, how about labor?
Yeah.
Right. It was fought over states' rights. States' rights to do what? Determine whether they were pro-slavery or anti-slavery.
Yep.
Right. I mean, all you got to do is figure out the history of how Texas was brought in to the United States over the big issue of, is it going to be a free or a slave state? right?
Several states, same, yeah.
No,
It's a big deal.
It was a balance, right? There was a big balance. So,
It's-
yeah, in fact, the term Civil War itself was a compromise. About how to refer to it in, a school,
How to
what
brand it.
name to put it, right? How to brand it.
So, John, I'd say that I grew up in South Texas and I would say, okay, Civil War. There was a Civil War, I get it, north, south, stuff like that. So I go to school, in Lookout Mountain, which is overlooking Chattanooga. And, what I learned there, what I didn't take me too long to understand was that Black people had their place. Okay, so this would be early '70s. So Black people had their place and they knew they had their place. If you talk to them, whether you're working alongside somebody doing yard work, weekends to make some extra money. All types of settings, as a young person. And that's what I think of the Civil War, because the Civil War was really serious. It was like really oppression to the Black people. And it was definitely about slavery. It was definitely about the plantations, it's about the money and the wealth. And so you see that in cities, like a Chattanooga, and those type of things. I know I'm being recorded, so I'm thinking maybe I shouldn't say that, but.
Hey, that's,
That's been fact.
And the irony
To me,
is-
that's what, my impression, that's what it did to me.
the irony is, you talk about, South Texas or West Texas, how much slavery was down there?
On the books, or
Well, right, I mean, it wasn't, I mean, that's the irony, is that a lot of the states that were brought in had nothing to do, or it wasn't like a primary factor in statehood. Right? How about Robert E. Lee?
Well, I grew up in Midland, Texas, and so the first high school that hit Levy was Midland High School. But the new high school, and I went to Midland High School. So the new high school was Robert E. Lee High School. And so, all of this Confederate flag stuff had to do with high school rivalry. And no, absolutely not, because that's the other high school, and that was our rival high school. And that was really all that meant to me at that time, again, as a white girl, it really was just all about, oh, that's not my school, I ain't flying that flag. And I'm not really going that. And so I find it, they're struggling right now. I think still, maybe they've figured it out in the last couple of years, what to name it now, because even in Midland, it's not gonna be named Robert E. Lee. And so growing up, the Civil War was about slavery, and it was a war, and lots of people died. There were battles. I don't know, I had to pass the test, whatever. But that was really all, and Lee was the losing general, they lost, and the North won, and here we all are now. I was not from a military family particularly. My dad was in the oh, no, I'm gonna say the name of it. In World War II. Anyway, so, and I knew nothing about West Point at all until I met Bob, who grew up at West Point. His dad was an engineering professor at West Point. His brother, went to West Point and was served in the Army as a doctor for his whole career, until the second career, of course, and so I learned a lot about it from that, and I knew nothing about it before that. But we went and visited finally. I hadn't been there in a long time, and we visited. Never registered to me that everything was named after Lee.
Yeah.
Just did not register at all. Because I was just, it's beautiful, it's amazing. We were hearing all the stories about when he grew up and blah, blah, blah. Did not register, and that says it just wasn't important.
You always hear him called General Robert E. Lee, right? But his real rank is Colonel.
Is that right?
Right? That's the highest rank he got in the U.S. Army.
Before the secession.
He's just a rebel. It's one of the points that you'll read about in the book. The author says, goes through and says that at West Point you have barracks that are named after You know, the greatest combat general the US has ever produced, you know, 5-star general, 4-star generals, presidents, and a colonel, a traitorous colonel. Okay, because the Confederate States never existed as a
Why?
legitimate entity.
But why? I mean, he was a loser.
Right,
We're
well,
gonna get into that.
He did.
Well, see, and that's and I think that when I heard you say that, I bristled when you said he was the one who lost, because that's not the education I received.
It's kind of weird because he was in Texas.
Yes.
I
I mean, he's revered, right? I mean, so, what was the name of the orange car in the Dukes of Hazzard? General Lee, right? The bars and stars on top, right? I love that. I was singing it yesterday. I was roping cattle. That being said, my education growing up, formal or otherwise, was a revered, noted military leader. And Kitty and I, we've traveled to Vicksburg, which is in Mississippi, and I've been there several times, and all through the South and in Virginia. He was not a losing general. It is a war that came to an end, but the idea of losing never entered my vocabulary until adulthood. And so I think there is that nuance there, especially in the southern states. And he does a fabulous job of helping to unpack that mentality of how do we rebrand this where we don't really come down hard on Lee. We don't name him a traitor. We keep him revered. And what is it that we're going to do in the South to ensure that we acknowledge the surrender? Well, we're going to erect all these monuments all through the South and rename high schools and keep hope alive in those regards. And so this, as a Southern perspective, this isn't, I mean, there's something bristly to me when I read and I hear about him being the one who lost or a traitor. That's unfamiliar language to me.
Even reading the book, when I did, and when you read it, I mean, the author comes out in no uncertain terms and says he was a traitor.
Yes.
He killed more American soldiers than any other general in the history of the United States, right? But even when I read that, I was like, man, that sort of was a punch, because you always hear Southern gentleman, honorable, was torn in this choice between Virginia and the US, and
Hey, John.
great tactician.
John. Yeah, real quick. I have a little bit of a different point of view. I grew up in the Midwest, and I didn't know anything about the Civil War other than what I'd heard in school until I saw the Gone with the Wind. And it was very romanticized what the South was. They didn't talk about slavery. They had Mammy, living in the house with, I don't know nothing about birth and no babies and all that kind of stuff. But they were shown as, they were pretty happy with what they were doing. It wasn't like they were being forced to it. And a lot of that was the media's portrayal. I understand that the book was it was considered an American classic, but it doesn't really deal with the root causes, and it wasn't supposed to. It was supposed to talk about this idealized life in the South on plantations, and I think a lot of people had that picture in their mind that these plantation owners. What was his name? I can't remember the name of the one of the protagonists that went off and was killed, but they were heroes, and they were defending their way of life, and the rest of the country was trying to take that away from them.
Yeah, thank you. And Diane, I didn't see your hand up, and do you still want to offer something?
Okay, I grew up in the Midwest also, and I remember learning about the Civil War as a war over slavery. And when I came to Texas, especially being a docent at the Bullock, I learned a whole different perspective to how the Civil War was taught in the South in what had been a Confederate state. And it was referred to as the War of Secession of Northern aggression. It was referred to as, over states' rights, not over slavery. And, a totally different way of looking at it than I had experienced growing up in a different part of the country.
Yeah, thank you, Diane. I hope this is helpful in beginning to journey some of your brain a little bit about approaching this, so you're not totally cold as you're starting to get into this. John and I, and John mostly, has helped map out a recommended path of how we're going to travel through this book. And if you don't have it yet, order it this week. I see some of you have it.
It's also, there are copies at the Spicewood Springs Library. I just looked online, so I've got one on hold, but I think they have 3 copies down there, so.
Okay.
You want to get one before you order it?
Yes. So go ahead and grab that this week. And if you you can have a card shipped, let us know. We'll get the book for you. I appreciate that John wants to start with the end. That's how I do wedding rehearsals and funeral rehearsals. I start with the end and then go back to the beginning. So what we want to read for next week is chapter 7. Now, you may feel like you've missed out on everything pulling up to the culmination, but hang in there with us. You may want to read the introduction, you may not, but read the introduction and chapter 7, and that's what we're going to review next week. We will not meet on the 18th, as it is Father's Day. We'll take that Sunday off. However, you might consider some Juneteenth materials in your reading for that week, as Juneteenth is a pretty significant day of observance in the state of Texas. And then we'll be back on the 25th. We'll cover chapters 1 and 2 on the 25th. We'll take the 4th of July off, and then we'll be back at it, and we'll pick up chapters 2 and 3 on the 9th. We're going to go all the way through the 6th. And John and I will be hit and miss. One of the two of us will be here mostly. John sometimes may be in the virtual world. Next week, John for sure will be here in person, but I will not. So you'll also notice that those last 2 weeks of July, we do those a little out of order as well. We'll hit chapter 4, then skip to 6, and then back to 5. So just take note of that. We'll remind you as we go. Anything else you want to add before?
No, the reason that I picked it to sort of follow those out of order chapters is, let's just get right to it. Read his conclusions in the chapter, and then, because we know where we're going to end up. But for me, the interesting part was the journey that the author went on in the first part of the book. Chapters 1 through 4, he talks about his childhood, growing up. All he wanted to be was a Southern gentleman. I mean, he said that no career, just wants to be a Southern gentleman, patterned after primarily Robert E. Lee, to the point where he went to Washington and Lee College just because of that. Turned down appointments at other academies. Then his time in the military. So we want to sort of look at it like a funnel. Okay. How in this author's life was the myth, the structural racism embedded into his DNA as a person, right? And he's going to tell us, and he's then going to tell us how he deconstructs that. And he does it through the lens of the military, primarily, which is the institution that he came to love more than the institution of the South and the Southern myth, which he grew up in. And so I want to take us on a parallel kind of journey that'll allow us, as we're reading about the author's journey, to reflect on our own journeys so far, and how might we have gotten structural racism or discrimination embedded in our DNA, even though we're not sitting there wanting, to receive that. you can't avoid it, okay? That's why it's structural and systemic. And then we'll take a look at, as we're looking at the military, I want us to look at the church writ broadly. Okay, which the military is supposed to be a slice of America. It's supposed to be the most the biggest meritocracy. Yes, that one. Where you get promoted, not only based on what you've done, but primarily based on your potential to be even better at higher ranks, right? And you know, sort of like our church, our denomination, or the church writ large. And then when he gets in, focuses in on West Point, he didn't go to West Point, but he was a professor, a deputy head of the history department, and a professor emeritus. And so he takes a look at that and shows the institution of West Point, which is supposed to be this, you know, city on the hill kind of place within the military and within the nation, shows that even this place gets affected by that, okay, and where compromises are made in this place, and so we're at that point, want us to look at hope and see like what we may be doing unintentionally, or you know, compromising or whatever. Again, sometimes not ourselves, but by virtue of even where we are located and how we ended up here in 1974. Right, so that's why I structured it like that.
It's great.
So,
Great. All right, let us join together in our unison closing prayer. Excuse me. God, make us instruments of your justice. Where there is a false and untenable peace, let us sow dissent. Where there is injustice, fury. Where there is oppression, hope. Where there is false fluorescence, profound darkness. Where there is social depression, life. Where there is crime and poverty, a sustainable economic infrastructure. Grant that we may not so much seek to be uplifted as to uplift, to be seen as to be others. For it is in protesting the sin of cynicism that we can more fully acknowledge our own sin. It is in demanding justice of the powerful that we live out God's demands for us. It is in rejoicing in that earthly freedom that we are born into God's strength. Amen. Peace be with you all. We'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.
last night.
Have a good week, everyone.
Side rule. Yeah, like